Hello and welcome to another Daily Dose of Insights powered by Container Exchange. My name is Christian, and every other day we bring to you the key news, stories, and data points that move container markets, hence your business. Today it's Friday, so it's called Fundamental Fridays here at Container Exchange, where we typically look at one or two fundamental topics that move the markets and that are interesting to be discussed. Let me quickly share my screen to give you a little bit more guidance of what I'm talking about. So today, just one core headline. I read over the course of this morning an article in the Hellenic Shipping News by Xeneta, focusing on the discussion of cargo movements between the US West Coast and the US East Coast. And there was a big discussion over the past couple of months because we saw significant movement of cargo volumes from the West Coast over to the East Coast. Now here on the left-hand side, we really only look at Far East imports into the US and the share of those imports on the East Coast versus the West Coast. And the sort of light blue is import volume into the West Coast. The dark blue is the East Coast, and that violet curve actually is the share of East Coast. So the East Coast market share of purely containerized imports from the Far East into the US. And what you can see is really that the share of the East Coast increased consistently and significantly, particularly, of course, towards the end of the COVID pandemic. So that we're now at about 37, 38% of all import volumes from the Far East. If you also consider other import destinations, so to speak, or origins, the share of East Coast and Gulf ports is actually above 50% compared to the West Coast volumes, which historically have been the sort of main gateway into the US. And now, of course, the key question on the discussion table is: will this cargo move back into the West Coast ports now that stuff like disruptions due to COVID, congestion, labor disputes, all of that have sort of abated, and the Panama Canal poses another challenge for cargo moving from the Far East to the East Coast? And of course, you can also ask another question: is what about the rate spread? Because if it's cheaper to import cargo into the West Coast ports than it is into the East Coast, and there is a positive rate spread, so typically East Coast cargo volumes are more expensive from the Far East, then there might be an argument that cargo should move back into the West Coast ports. But if we look at the data and the spread, we see here the spread of the East Coast rates over the West Coast, and the dark one is the short spread, so the short spot rates, and blue is the long spread, all courtesy of Xeneta here. We see that rates or rate spreads are actually in line now with our historical averages, which doesn't really speak for a price pressure to move cargo volumes back into the West Coast, but rather to keep things as they are. Your cargo is straight where the big consumer markets are in the US, the main East Coast metropolitan areas, you also don't have to have another modal switch onto a truck or rail to get your cargo there. So, long story short, it stays interesting here. There's lots of factors at play that determine whether shippers actually import more volumes through the West Coast or the East Coast. But looking at the price spread, we don't think that this will be one significant driver here. Perfect. Thanks a lot for tuning in. So a very short Fundamental Friday session, just purely focusing on cargo volumes into the US. Stay tuned. Have a fantastic weekend, and see you all on Monday. Take care.